So my name is Marisa Gomez. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History, and we are excited to offer tonight's program in support of our CZU Lightning Complex and Community Science Project. And I'm also joined today by some of our partners, including Justin Lung from the Kenneth S. Norris Center for Natural History. Justin, you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone.
Hello. And then Lisa Robinson from the San Lorenzo Valley Museum.
Hi.
And of course, also Zane. Hello. So we also have another partner that I just want to mention really quick and give them some credit. So we're also partnering with the California Native Plant Society on this project. And tonight's talk is a part of this community science endeavor that we're doing. We're working with the CNPS's Rare Plant Program and their Fire Followers team to monitor the impacts of the CZU Lightning Complex on our landscape. And we're doing that by involving our community in the process. And I'll make sure that before you leave tonight, you are able to hear other ways that you can be involved with that. And it's also important to note that the area burned by the CZU Lightning Complex is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Sayanta, Yupi, Chitoni, and Ashistaka, and the Ramaytush-speaking Kuroste tribes. And today, these lands are stewarded by the Amamutsin tribal band, who are working hard to fulfill their obligations to Creator, to care for and steward Mother Earth and all living things through relearning efforts and the Amamutsin Land Trust. And at this point, I am going to be bringing in our partners again before we invite Zane to share his presentation, because the fires of last August have had many impacts on our community. And while tonight we're going to be focusing on the ecological impacts, there was a great community loss for those of us in the area as well. And both of our partner organizations who are here tonight, they both had to evacuate their museums during the fires, though thankfully did not suffer any damage. And so I'm grateful to be joined by Lisa Robinson, who's going to share a few words on behalf of the San Lorenzo Valley Museum, our partners.
So I'd like to welcome you to Coast Redwoods and Fire with Zane Moore. Firstly, for those who are new to the San Lorenzo Valley Museum, the museum is owned and operated by the San Lorenzo Valley Historical Society, which was originally formed as the Boulder Creek Historical Society in 1976. Our mission is to preserve and share the history of the San Lorenzo Valley. We own a museum gallery in Boulder Creek, the Grace Episcopal Gallery, a National Register listed former church building. And last year we opened the Faye G. Bellardi Memorial Gallery in Felton, also a National Register listed former church building. It's in this gallery that you'll see the Look, Act, Inspire exhibition curated by the Ken Norris Center for Natural History, and we look forward to having you visit. We acknowledge that the Grace Episcopal Church building and the Faye G. Bellardi Memorial building are located on the ancestral lands of the Awaswas-speaking people and are part of the traditional territory of today's Amamutsin tribal band. Now, I first met Zane in 2013 as the editor of the MAR publication, Redwood Logging and Conservation in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Zane contributed 2 wonderful articles on albino redwoods. And at that time, it's a long time ago, Zane was an undergraduate botany student at Colorado State University. In 2016, Zane gave a talk for the San Lorenzo Valley Museum entitled How to Build the Tallest Tree. It was then a program of the Auto Tree exhibition, which was curated by Frank Perry and hosted both by the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History and the San Lorenzo Valley Museum. I was very fortunate to be on a walk with Zane, where he demonstrated the techniques he used to determine the height of the trees. And I should say that Zane was able to find the tallest redwood south of San Francisco, which was in Big Basin Redwood State Park. At that time, we practiced measuring the heights of several of the redwoods on the Redwood Trail at Big Basin Redwood State Parks, how long ago that now seems. As a CZU fire evacuee and one whose home was saved by the incredible volunteers that battled the flames as they came through our property, I'm especially grateful to Zane for giving this talk. Many of our museum members and volunteers lost their homes in the inferno. Many could not return for several months due to the smoke damage to their properties. Some have decided not to rebuild and have moved away. But we all mourn the severe damage that has been done to the old growth redwoods and their environs. Thank you, Zane.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you all for having me. I guess, is it time now for me to share my screen?
It'll be
Marissa?
just about that time, but also I wanted to make sure that Justin had a chance to say hello on behalf of the Norris Center too, just really quickly before we hand it over.
Thanks,
to you.
Marissa. And thanks, Lisa, for that important message. Hi again, I'm a worker at the Norris Center at UC Santa Cruz. And I just wanted to thank you all for coming today and just mention that this talk is given in partnership as one of our programs for the Look, Act, and Inspire exhibit that's currently being hosted at the San Lorenzo Valley Museum in Felton, the Belardi Gallery, which is now also open to the public, which we invite you all to come and visit sometime soon. The exhibit will be up until the end of June, and you can come visit Thursdays, Saturdays, and Sundays 1 to 4, and Fridays 4 to 7. We also have an online virtual exhibit that partners with this because we weren't sure if we would be able to have an in-person exhibit at the time. I've put the link in the chat. It's Santa Cruz County Naturalist.ucsc.edu. I welcome you to come check that out as well if you don't think you'll be able to come to the in-person exhibit. But it's a great space and an awesome exhibit. And it's meant to showcase the naturalist of Santa Cruz County. And so I hope that you can come and check it out and enjoy it. And with that, I would like to pass it back to Marissa or Zane to go ahead and talk.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Justin. And we're also hosting a program with Justin on Monday that I'll send a link to you all about. That's a community science event too. So, but without further ado, I think Lisa gave a great introduction of Zane, and I just want to hand it back over to him to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Marissa. Let me share my screen if I can find it. Let me see. Was I already sharing? Sorry.
No.
Was I already sharing my screen? Here, let me try.
All right, there you go.
This now, does this work?
Yes, that is working great.
Perfect. Great. Let me get my little pointer so that you all can see my pointer. 1 second.
And I'll also just reiterate that if you have questions at any point, just write them in the chat. And like kind of halfway through Zane's talk, we're gonna see if people want to chime in too.
Yeah, yeah, thank you all for the introduction. Just to explain how this talk is going to work, I'm focusing on, there's going to be 2 parts of the talk. It'll be split basically in half. The first half is going to be about redwoods and fire. What do we know currently about how redwoods coexist with fire, and how do they respond to fire and all of that. Then the second half of the talk will be looking at the CZU complex fire, looking specifically at Big Basin, what's it look like now and how it will look in the future. So because of the 2 parts, I'll stop and take a few questions at this redwood and fire ecology thing before we move on to Big Basin specifics. All right, so to begin, redwoods are fire adapted plants. They're like any other plant that grows in chaparral ecosystems. They have evolved with fire disturbance as being a commonplace thing. This photo is someplace I suggest you all go if you want to understand how redwoods are like chaparral plants. It's at the Quail Hollow Pygmy Redwood Forest. It's at the top of Quail Hollow County Park. If you hike up to the top of the hill there and look around, you will see these small redwood trees growing as understory to plants like madrone and manzanita. These trees are only about an inch in diameter, but they're 70 to 100 years old, if not older. So it's a pretty unique place. But it's a place that shows and demonstrates that redwoods, first and foremost, are chaparral trees. They're the southernmost conifer of the major conifers in the Pacific Northwest. And because they're so far south because of the fact that they deal with fire and live with fire fairly well. The main adaptation for redwoods to prevent fire burning and fire death, or death from fire, is their bark. As you all are aware, the bark is spongy and airy. It's made up of fibers and dead phloem cells. Phloem is what transports the sugars, and they hollow out as the phloem ages. So that's why those air pockets are in the wood, and that's why the wood is spongy. That air reduces heat transfer from fires and provides insulation to the tree. And it protects little young buds that hang out underneath the bark, waiting to be released due to biotic or abiotic damage. In the case of fire, we're talking abiotic damage. Now, the redwood's red color is due to tannins in its bark. And what the whole point of tannins are for is to basically quickly char. The tannins char up, they do not fully combust. So some of the energy in their chemical bonds does not fully oxidize, meaning the fire is reduced, and it ideally prevents fire and heat from spreading into the deeper, more fragile tissues of the redwood tree. The tannins are also present in the needles. So this is a branch that I saw a few days after the CZU Lightning Complex fire started. It's all black. It's been burned and charred, but it hasn't disintegrated into ash. I found this actually 20 miles away in Los Gatos. So those redwood needles it was burning hot, and the redwoods, they were getting picked by the heat and dropped 20 miles away, in this case in Los Gatos. But not burned fully, not combusted fully, and that is the purpose that tannins provide here to these trees. Then obviously, you all know and have probably seen a burned redwood tree at this point. You know that they reproduce through basal sprouts and bole or sprouting along the trunk, bole sprouting. So these sprouts lay dormant and wait underneath the bark, and hopefully are protected by the bark, so that once the fire or the stress is over with, they can reemerge and grow new branches, and in some cases new trees if the trees have fallen over or completely died. What's neat that indicates this is an adaptation is that this is one of the first things the redwood embryo and redwood seedling does. You know, redwood seedlings famously come up and put out 2 leaves. In the center of those 2 leaves, you have the bud for the new stem to grow, but also there are a bunch of dormant buds that are set aside and make up this burl to create basal sprouts as the tree needs basal sprouts, you know, should damage like this happen. So this starts happening very early in development and is a critical part of coast redwood recovery from fire. So trees grow in 2 different places. They grow from the tips at their shoots and their roots, and then they grow in width from their trunk, right? And so when a fire comes through and it burns the upper canopy of a tree, these leaves are no longer going to be photosynthetic. And in that case, they can't provide sugars and food for the rest of the cells like the trunk to continue to grow in width. So what the tree does right after burning is invest mostly in rebuilding its crown, not rebuilding anything to do with the wood or trunks. Focus on rebuilding the crown, regain that photosynthetic surface area that was lost, sometimes up to an acre or more of photosynthetic surface area. That's a lot to regain and a lot to rebuild that the tree has to do. So it focuses first on the leaves and sort of leaves the wood, or the vascular cambium that makes the wood, sort of hangs that out to dry and waits for a while as it rebuilds its crown. That in turn means that after fires, wood growth declines severely. So after the first year of a fire, the wood growth is typically declines by 27 to 32%. And it can even decline more 3 years after the fire, 46%. This is all because the tree is investing in creating these new leaves and new foliage to continue to grow. However, after this decline post-fire, which can happen for up to 7 years, maybe even a decade, after that occurs and after the crowns are rebuilt, then the redwood tree then goes on to produce a lot of wood production, up to 40% or more than what would be expected normally. So here we see some wood from Big Sur, and there was a fire in 1985 and a fire in 1999. And you can see those points on this graph where the blue is what we would expect had a fire not come through, just based on climate, how wide we would expect the tree rings to be. And you see these black declines in tree ring growth, both after the 1985 fire and after the 1999 fire. So through looking at tree rings, that's one way in which you can tell where major fires have occurred. So when we look at this event here, there's another dip there. And indeed, in 1977, there was another fire that happened in this Big Sur forest. By subtracting what we would expect from normal paleoclimate records and what we see in the tree rings, we get this red line where there are some areas of severe lack of growth that we would not expect based on climate. And these indicate prior fires. So all of these years are fire years based on the tree rings that are growing there. So not only just using tree rings can we tell that fires have occurred, but there are anatomical signatures as well in the wood itself. So what does that look like? First, you can get some wood staining here. These are due to what we call traumatic resin ducts. So the resin, or like the sticky sap part of a pine tree, or in this case, a redwood tree, those ducts that hold the resin end up heating up so much that they burst, and that resin stains the wood. So we see that here in panel A. Panel B, again, we have smaller rings, and you can also have very pronounced late wood. Late wood is the dark part of the tree ring here, where you can see this is all one ring and it's really, really thick. That's because the tree's growth got so severely slowed down by the fire that the cells remain pretty dense and pretty thick relative to the rest of the trunk. Then you may have heard that water inside the crowns can actually get so hot that it boils. Yes, that's true, and it can be like a pressure cooker and actually blow out the cells, like you see here in E. You can see the cells are all nice and uniform, and then they all look much bigger and sort of burst open. This is due to fire heating up the water inside those cells. Interestingly enough, this can also happen during a growing season. If there's a quick freeze, the water inside those cells can freeze and cause what's called a frost ring as well. So you have similar anatomy due to water getting too hot or too cold in these xylem cells that transport the water. Okay. Then the other thing that you've probably seen already is towards the outside of a tree, like in a goose pen or one of those hollows at the base of a tree. If that burns, it might burn part of the cambium, but it will send a signal for the tree to try and regrow and put bark back on that. So here at A is where the tree has opened up and started burning. And the burn actually went all the way back into here. You can see the char in that wood there at B. and it killed the cambium. It killed the cell layer that produces new wood. Deeper in, over here at C, you can see the staining due to those resin ducts, again, bursting due to the heat, but the cambium has survived. And so that cambium will begin growing out, and growing out slowly at first, but then becoming more and more rapid over time to try and heal up that wound that was created by the fire, okay? And again, the whole point is to get bark on the outside, because redwood wood burns very easily, but redwood bark, not so much. So if you can get bark around your wood, that's the ideal situation for these trees, okay? Here's an example from a giant sequoia. Each one of these little white markers here is indicative of a fire event. So I'm just going to zoom in on the top portion of this, and you can see fires from 1429 all the way to 1950. You have regrowth, regrowth, regrowth again and again of the same burning from the side situation. And then the cambium regrows and tries to cover up that burn. And this tree was largely successful, because you can see there's 10 or more fires that it's regrown and dealt with and not succumb to damage that would kill the tree. Okay, so redwoods do this too. This is just a giant sequoia in a particular area that burned quite frequently, I think from giant forest in the Southern Sierras. Okay, so using wood, we can look at old trunks and see what the fire return interval ends up being in a coast redwood forest. And one study looked range wide at coast redwoods and found fires returned every 2 to 87 years, with a majority of those fires returning every 6 to 25 years, so about once in a human generation or so. There was a study just recently in 2014 that looked at Santa Cruz Mountains specifically between Año Nuevo and Davenport, and found that the average return interval is roughly every 40 years. That was the median average. The mean was 60 years. So roughly 40 to 60 years, we would expect a fire to occur in the Santa Cruz Mountains based on this data from 1350 to present. Okay. So, so we can do this using tree rings and looking at anatomical markers on stumps and on living trees. Actually, a kind of neat aside, this giant sequoia situation, you can actually see this in old petrified wood as well. I got to look at a petrified giant sequoia round from Oregon 34 million years ago. And indeed, it had some fire markings where there was some old ancient fire that you could see in these rings that were petrified, which was pretty neat. So these things are diagnostic, and you can easily study it as a scientist as long as the specimen is preserved, whether it's preserved in a stump, whether it's petrified, whether it's charcoal. You could still see tree rings in charcoal. However you do it, you can try and reconstruct fire history. That being said, then we can answer the question, when do redwood forests burn? This is based on since human habitation of redwood forests, and it's separated based on the north, central, and south part of the redwood range. And you can see, unsurprisingly, that they burn in late summer and early fall. So about the time that we saw fires burning in the CZU fire complex. So the other thing that fires can do is provide habitat. Usually we think of these fires in large redwood forests providing habitat to birds. The Post wrote an article about condors potentially returning to the Santa Cruz Mountains. While we have yet to see whether that happens, we know that condors like to nest in these redwood hollows and parts of the trunks that are damaged by fire, because it gives them a big area to nest in a high enough up position to not have to worry about predators too much attacking their nests. So condors, possibility, woodpeckers, certainly, and other bird species may find that certain areas of a redwood forest that's been damaged by fire ends up becoming a home for these organisms. Okay, so this is the part of the talk where we're going to start transitioning into Big Basin and local specifics. I'll take a few, if people have a few questions about this stuff we already talked about first, I'm happy to take them now, and then otherwise we will continue and hear about Big Basin.
Great. Yeah, we did have a couple of questions come through the chat, and I will also in a moment make it so that people can speak if they want. You can either like indicate in the chat that you would like to speak, or you can use where it says reactions and then raise your hand.
Yeah,
but for
we'll
now,
just do like 5 or so minutes here, and then we'll move on to talking about the CZU fire.
Cool.
Part.
And so the first question we got was from Maura, and she's curious about damaged redwood trees, and how do you know what trees are damaged beyond repair when it comes to fire?
Yeah, well, looking for the sprouts along the entire trunk of the tree, or as much of the trunk as possible. If there are no green sprouts, or the green sprouts are sporadic on the trunk, then that redwood tree is probably not going to make it. And so we'll talk a little bit about what we saw in Big Basin, because it looks like some of the redwood trees will not make it. So I'll show some pictures of that later in the talk.
Cool, thanks. And then Marta Bell is curious about the redwood trees that you shared early on up at Quail Hollow, and noting that they were relatively small in stature. Can you clarify the reason for why they are so small?
Yeah, so that pygmy redwood forest in Quail Hollow is due to the fact that it's a sandy soil. It's redwoods growing in that sandhill soil, where typically the ponderosa pine do much better. So if you want to see this variation, it's just phenotypic variation based on how good or bad the growing conditions are. In that area, it's really, really bad and awful for redwood, but we still see redwood there. So it's kind of neat to see these redwood trees growing pretty slow.
And and ponderosa pines are so huge too. It's so interesting that that for some species, these huge ones can grow, and for others it has this effect. We did have another question from Lisa. How hot does a fire need to be to affect the rings? Could a lower temperature fire not be recorded?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So that's a great question. I was going to mention with this graph that some of these higher numbers here could simply be a sampling situation where not every fire gets recorded by a tree. It needs to be hot enough to heat up inside of the bark. I'm not sure an exact temperature, but it needs to be hot enough to be felt by the bark. The other thing is these anatomical indicators are more common lower down towards the stump, and then less common the higher up the tree you go, because higher up in the tree, those experience less frequent fires, or the wood up there experiences less frequent fires. So that's a great question. Thanks.
And now from the rings to the roots, Laura is curious, what is the immediate impact of fire on the roots of redwood trees?
I don't know if it's known. I think the ground provides enough insulation that certainly in wet areas, the roots do fine. But if the fire can get inside of the bark, that just like in the trunk, if it can get inside of the bark and the roots, the fire can burn the wood in the roots and leave these big root scars. We saw an amount of erosion issues in Big Basin due to roots burning, the wood in the roots burning. But the root tips, I don't think get affected, or we don't know too much.
Okay. And then a couple other questions. Any way you can tell from the wood anatomy of historical fire return interval whether the fires were natural occurrences like lightning or human caused by the indigenous peoples living in the area?
That's a great question. I don't think we could know that.
Okay.
I don't think we could know that. We could maybe figure that out if there was enough sampling. I would imagine lightning caused natural fires would burn a larger area than these more controlled indigenous burning practices. So that would be a potential answer, but yeah, that work has not been done.
Yeah, or if it's like you can kind of infer what the lightning interval was, and then you see more fires, I suppose, potentially.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
And I skipped over a question from Maura about pollen. Apparently, there's been a tremendous amount of pollen from undamaged redwoods very close to the CZU complex fire. She said that she's never seen anything like it before. Do you have any insights as to why there might be more pollen?
Yeah, this will be the last question and we'll move on from here, and we can do the rest of the questions at the end.
Cool.
But just for this pollen thing, when a redwood tree gets stressed as they did during the fire, even on the edges of the fire, these redwood trees might be low on water or that sort of thing, and pollen cones become the cheapest way to sexually reproduce. It's a lot cheaper than making seed cones. So a lot of these trees make pollen because of stress, and because it might be that, they're freaking out and it might be the end for them. So they're going to try and reproduce in any way they can.
That's fascinating. Okay, so we do have some more, but we'll save them for later. So Susie and Cynthia, hang tight, and then Zane, you can take it away.
Yep. Thank you. So we'll move forward and talk about the Big Basin fire before the CZU fire. So 1904 was the last fire in Big Basin prior to the CZU fire in 2020. This map is thanks to Steve Singer. That fire started near Waterman's Mill up by Waterman's Gap. As you come down from Castle Rock, sort of in there is where that fire started. And it burned for 20 days. It burned into Big Basin and became a crown fire within the park. But based on the amount of living Doug fir in the area, I'd imagine the crown fire was fairly moderate intensity. It didn't end up killing any of these larger Douglas fir trees that were in this fire perimeter. So this was a fairly moderate fire of moderate intensity. Crown fires are never good, they're never great, but this one would have been fairly low intensity as it occurred, as far as I can tell based on looking at the trees currently today. Now, this fire was mild by comparison to the CZU. It happened in a similar way and even at a similar time, again, with the autumn north winds blowing the fire from north to south and burning these areas. So I have a video here of the CZU fire at Big Basin, and it shows the kiosk, the entrance kiosk here. We're going to see headquarters, and we'll see the Washington tree. So this is what a crown fire looks like in redwood trees. Here, I'll put it back to the Washington tree up here, burning fire in the crown. Pretty intense looking fire up there. There was a lot of heat probably at this point burning this tree. Now, we'll look at what the Washington tree looks like in a few minutes today, what it looks like. But yeah, this is a crown fire and a pretty intense crown fire, especially if the redwood crown itself is burning, considering all the tannins and all these other protective measures that redwoods have to deal with fire. So the CZU fire, as you all are aware, it was a horrible event, damaged 7,000 structures, and it burned 86,000 acres, so an area of 135 square miles in 38 days. This map here is color-coded based on the day of the fire, and you can see the first days are these dark green areas, so there, it looks like there's about 5 areas where lightning ignited the fire. And then the third day is this big green swath that burned through a majority of Big Basin all at once. That was due to the northern winds starting up on the third day and causing this fire to rapidly move. And it was this day that got people to have to evacuate very quickly and we didn't know what would happen. That we were at the mercy of the weather, really. So this fire burned 73% of the old growth redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains, about 5,200 acres. Some other areas of old growth that were not burned are places like Henry Cowell and Portola Redwood State Park. So I highly recommend you see Portola Redwood State Park if you need to get that redwood old growth itch taken care of, Portola or Henry Cowell. It burned all but 6 of the tallest redwood trees in the region. And then according to Steve Singer, it burned roughly 60% of marbled murrelet habitat. So areas that we know marbled murrelet's nest based on surveys, roughly 60% of that forest has burned to some degree. So yeah, really awful fire. And now we're just dealing with the impacts of what's going to happen because of it. When this fire exploded, this is what it looked like from the Bay Area. This is the Bayland area out by Palo Alto. I happened to be there visiting my parents at that time. And so this is what that fire looked like. Big Basin's out over here, Buteno's out over here. And people had to leave very quickly. They abandoned campsites in Big Basin. So here's one campsite completely abandoned in an area that actually didn't seem to burn much at all, which is kind of amazing. A tent made it through in the middle of the park. This is by J Camp area, just a little bit southeast of headquarters. So people had to leave quickly. They didn't have time to tear down their campsites because the fire was rolling through. And here's an image, satellite image of Big Basin, and we'll look at before and after. So this is 2015, and then here is 2020, about a month or so after the fires. And the first thing I want to point out here is that this fire had varying degrees of severity. So you can see just by looking at the crowns, we have green areas, brown areas, black, like matchstick looking areas. And we can quantify how the park burned based on these crowns. So there are areas of lower severity where it wasn't even a crown fire, moderate severity, high severity, and in some cases in the high severity areas, it must have been extreme severity because we saw high tree mortality. So, so first of all, patchy, not everywhere in Big Basin burned equally. So that's one thing. Here is an image from China grade. I was able to go into the park a few weeks ago with Steve Singer. So all these images that you're going to see of the fire came from a couple weeks ago in the park. So here's China grade. You can see green crowns here, green crowns, brown crowns, and some black crowns in the background. This is Pine Mountain for reference. So we're looking south into the park over the Sempervirens Creek watershed. So patchy, as you can see here, and as you could see in the satellites, it was patchily burned. This area was all chaparral, and the chaparral burned really hot and mostly to the ground. And so they're resprouting, basically rebuilding the entire park from the start. Okay, so we're going to start with the sad news first, and I'm going to try and end on a little bit more positive note, but there's not a lot of positive that came out of this fire, both from a human perspective, but also from an ecological perspective. So my estimate park-wide is that roughly about 2% of the redwood trees are going to be dead or have died or will die. Again, this is patchy. So most areas, the redwoods did okay, but some areas that burned extremely hot, like this place this is in Opal Creek on North Escape Road. I would imagine 40 to 50% of the redwood trees are not going to come back. You see, and you can see that here. There, of course, there's Douglas fir mixed in here, but you can see some trunks with green sprouts doing okay, but then a lot of trunks without green sprouts or with green sprouts on the base, like this tree here. And that's indicative of the fact that that tree is probably dead, that redwood tree. Douglas fir, basically anywhere in a crown fire, roughly 100% of them died in the crown fires. So unless there was no crown fire or a very low intensity crown fire, most of the Doug firs are dead. And I think this is the major point. This is probably the hardest point for me, I think, is Big Basin. The Douglas firs will not look the same for a few human lifetimes before they get to be like they once were. We hope that the Douglas fir can be seeded in the park because it is so patchy. It's hard to know whether any Douglas fir seeds are going to get to many of the areas that burned of high severity. And then with climate change, we expect this region to start looking more and more like Big Sur. And the first thing that you might notice when you go hiking in Big Sur, where are all the Doug fir? There are no Doug fir or very few Doug fir in Big Sur. And a lot of that has to do with the fire frequency, the fact that fires come in, burn real hot, and then the Doug firs don't have time to reach sexual maturity before another fire comes through. So hopefully that doesn't happen with Big Basin, but this is probably the hardest news. Most of the oak trees ended up dying in the fire, and then tan oaks, madrones, and huckleberry, they all died in the fire, but they all resprout because these are also chaparral adapted or fire adapted trees. So we're seeing resprouting on basically all of them, which is great news. So in 10 or 20 years, these should be back to looking relatively normal. So let's talk about a few of the famous areas in Big Basin. So this is headquarters, and here's the auto tree. Auto tree looks okay. There's a lot of green in its crown, should be okay. The Washington tree that was burning in that video I showed you is right here. You can see there's no green on the trunk whatsoever. My guess is that the Washington tree, we're gonna lose it. That was one of my favorite trees in the park. And so that it's a bummer that we're going to be losing that one most likely. This was right next to the Redwood Round, and here's headquarters again for perspective if you don't know where this is. The Mother of the Forest looks okay. It should survive and be just fine. State Parks made a video, like a drone video of the Mother of the Forest, which is pretty nice. So the Mother of the Forest has been through many fires with that hollowed out base, and this one, this tree will do just fine from this one also. The Father of the Forest, though, I think it's 50-50 for this tree, whether or not it will make it. It has some green in its crown, so it could recover, but there's not a lot of green on most of the trunks and most of the branches. So I worry about this tree. Something to consider is that we're also now entering a drought. And so these green branches that are coming on these trees are going to be dealing with major drought these first few years, or this at least first year. And so that could actually end up killing these trees post-fire if we aren't careful. So we'll see with the Father of the Forest. This tree, based on satellite, this was the widest tree known in the Santa Cruz Mountains. This picture was taken before the fire. It was as wide as the auto tree, but it was a single trunk at 19.3 feet wide. It has since fallen, and we know this based on looking at satellite imagery. It fell and it took out a few other trees next to it, which is a bummer. This tree is the largest tree in the Santa Cruz Mountains. It's located on the Sequoia Trail in Big Basin between 236 and Opal Creek. It's larger than Father of the Forest. It's larger than the giant in Henry Cowell, or at least it was until the fire. The top half of it snapped off. And so it's basically a burned hollow shell of a tree right now. And who knows if it's going to make it. I didn't get up close enough to see if there was green on the trunk, but it's no longer the largest. The Father of the Forest is the largest tree in the park, or in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So I mentioned lost murrelet habitat. So Steve Singer is the local murrelet expert here, and I got some of this data from him, but roughly 2/3 of their habitat has burned, as I mentioned. Murrelets need these large branches on old growth trees high up in the old growth for nesting. And usually those branches need to be 8 inches in diameter or more. And I have an image just of a redwood branch here showing, you can see some tree rings. And this branch is maybe 3 inches or 4 inches in diameter, and it's already 100, 150 years old. So all these small branches in the park are going to take a long time to regenerate and become large enough branches for murrelets to nest in. Thankfully, though, in the areas that didn't have crown fires, it seems like all the trees, including Doug fir, are still there and doing okay, and their large branches are still intact. So maybe the murrelets will nest in some of these patchy locations, but not everywhere. There are areas like Portola Redwood State Park and Pescadero Creek County Park that are unburned. So maybe the murrelet population will just focus on these areas. Only time will tell. Okay. So the tall trees. So the tallest trees in Big Basin survived, but they lost their foliage and their crown. So here's a before and after photo. This was taken again 2 weeks ago. So they're still tall. They're still over 100 meters in height. So they're 330 feet or so, but this is to a dead top for both of these. They did have green branches up to 95 meters up, so 310 feet. So that's good news, is that essentially their trunks survived this enough that those trees will be okay, and they'll continue to grow vertically as they rebuild their crowns. This was in an area that had a controlled burn a few years prior, and so that may have affected how hot the fire burned, though I think wind is probably a bigger factor than controlled burning. So some other good news, the tallest tree in the Santa Cruz Mountains is this 352-foot tall tree that was genotyped, or we're sequencing here at Davis. It's the Redwood genome tree. It's named after Scott Peden. Scott Peden took this photo shortly before he passed away in 2016. And you can see people down there at the bottom, really tiny. So this tree is 1,400 years old. It's the oldest known tree in the Santa Cruz Mountains that has been accurately dated using tree rings. And it's still standing, it's still survived, and based on satellite, it looks like it has a green crown. So it looks like it will be just fine. So that's great news. In areas that are wetter, so now moving on to some other good news, is the understory looks like it'll be okay. In areas that are wetter like this, I've seen some of the best sorrel that I've ever seen coming out. It did not die in the fire, which is kind of amazing. In drier areas, I'm sure it's a different story, but some of these wetter areas will be refugia for things like banana slugs and other organisms that need this understory to come back as soon as possible. We also saw some redwood seedlings. These were in areas of lower burn intensity to maybe moderate burn intensity, but there are redwood seedlings coming up from after this fire, which is great news. And then the wildflowers are pretty nice. So you can see there's still a lot of burn damaged trees in the background, but we have this Fremont star lily, we have blue dicks, there were tons of other different wildflowers that are looking pretty nice right now, including some calicortis, which are fire follower type flowers, like the Mariposa lilies. So, and globe lilies for that matter. So super nice with wildflower. I suspect that the understory will recover fairly quickly. I would say 2 to 5 years, and the understory should look roughly the same as what it did. It's just the overstory and the crowns of these trees that we don't know what the impacts are going to be. So what can we expect from the future? Well, this audience, I don't need to harp too much on climate change because I'm sure this audience is well aware of it. But the days with extreme fire conditions have doubled in California since the 1980s. California has had 30% drier and almost 2 degrees hotter autumns since the 1980s. And there was a story in the New York Times where I saw this, that climate scientists have noted that California's autumn precipitation is now 1 month later on average. And I know any of you, including me, I remember rain would come through in early to mid-October, and now it's becoming mid to late November. So yeah, we're seeing these trends. Here we can see temperature is going up over the last 20 years, precipitation's going down slightly, fire weather index is going up, and the area burned within California is going up, the area burned in autumn. So yeah, it's not getting better, it's getting worse with climate change. And I don't want to end it on too bad of a note, but that's sort of how I want to end it. So I want to thank everybody for inviting me, especially Steve Singer and Portia Halbert for allowing us access into the park here. We're part of this group called the Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council, where we talk quarterly about the bioregion of the Santa Cruz Mountains and how to maximize biodiversity here. So the fire has been a big topic for us discussing this. And then thank you to our hosts, Marisa, Justin, and Lisa, and for setting everything up. Here's a sunset on China Ridge. So thank you, and I'll take questions now.
Zane, thank you so much. My heart was broken and I was inspired, and so many things buzzing in my head, and we've got lots more questions for you too. So let me see if I can get through them. Kari's curious about that video that was so powerful. Was that the sound of the fire in the video? She's curious.
I think it's sound of well, fire and trees coming down. Some of the banging. Yeah. I think that's trees coming down in the fire.
And also the images of the campsites too, just so haunting. Yeah. So Ev is curious back to like the resprouting of redwoods and how that's an indication of if they've survived. How long after fires will they start? And like if a tree's not showing that yet, is there still hope?
Yeah, so resprouting will start immediately after a fire. So I know I went to some other parts that weren't in the state parks just to see what happened to the trees. And it looked like a lot of the younger trees were resprouting even a month after the fire, or maybe 2 months after the fire this winter. So like October, they were resprouting. But I would say wait until about now, late spring, early summer. And if a tree isn't sprouting by now, that's not a good sign. They could still recover, but it's unlikely. We were actually seeing in Big Basin, there are some parts where the green sprouts are already turning brown, and it's springtime. So that's why I'm saying the drought, that I'm really concerned about the drought. And whether or not these sprouting trees are going to make it, simply because they're already showing signs of drought stress.
And it's unlikely that something like 2 years from now, we have a good rain year and that kind of like sparks them.
Well, they could barely hold on for a few years. So we'll have to see. Hopefully they can make it through. I'm like Father of the Forest. that's the tree that I'm really iffy on. I don't know yet,
Okay.
but I'm not. I don't know.
And that's the one that you
about-
said is now the largest tree in the Santa Cruz Mountains.
Right. Right.
Someone, Deborah, who's a docent at Henry Cowell, is curious about that. So the giant was the tallest, but it's no longer, or the largest, but it's no longer. Do you have any sense of like where it would be considered in the rank now, or is that kind of?
It's depending on whether the father survives or not, it'll be number 1 or number 2.
Okay.
Yeah. Its trunk is the same, its main trunk is the same size as the father of the forest, but the father of the forest has these extra reiterations that put it over the top.
Okay. And then getting back to the roots, to the soil, Moore is curious about mycorrhizal relationships with fungi, which I don't think redwoods actually have, but I know that there are fungi that have come back after the fires. Do you have any sense of how fire might impact that part of the soil?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. So redwoods do have mycorrhizal associations with specifically this group called arbuscular mycorrhizae.
Mhm.
Redwoods also have associations with fungi in their leaves. They're called endophytes, literally inside the plant, where there are fungi that'll make nitrogen, like fertilizer essentially, that live inside the leaves. I don't know how these trees, I don't know the status there.
Yeah.
I know that I have not seen any fungi since the fire in any of the burned areas.
Yeah, we had a presentation with a local mycologist, Christian Shores, a couple months ago. It was very preliminary findings from his survey sites, including one at Big Basin, and he has been finding mushrooms coming back, and I can include a recording of that presentation in the resources that I share out. But I think, yeah, there's still like so much.
Oh, great! So he did see mushrooms.
Yeah, including one that he had
Cool.
never seen before in his transect. So he's been going there for 3 years and recording what he's been finding on these 1 kilometer long transects in different locations throughout the county. And in his fire area ones, he saw this mushroom pop up that he had never seen before in his transect area. And he saw it pop up in like the thousands, which was really cool. And still waiting on official notes from him on what it is. But, yeah.
Cool.
And then that gets to another point. Yeah, there's so many different like case studies of what we're interested in learning, how the fire has impacted these different species and taxa. And back to the marbled murrelets, someone's curious about the need for those 8-inch diameter branches. Is it possible that there's a decent amount of snags left?
Yes,
on like
that's
a dead tree?
possible. It seems like marbled murrelets, it seems like they like to be shaded or protected somewhat by foliage. So the completely bare snags might not be very good, but in areas where maybe the trunk was damaged, but the trunk will still grow green foliage that kind of hides or obscures the nesting site, I could see marbled murrelets going for those types of areas. Yeah. Okay. So, but it's hard to say. I'm not sure if Steve Singer, I know Steve Singer is on this call, and I'm not sure if he would want to say more.
Yeah, Steve, if you want to, you can indicate so in the chat, and we'll let you unmute. Let me see. We also had some other questions come through. A lot of just like positive comments, actually. So I've got to scroll through them. And then, so back to the marbled murrelet. So maybe, yeah, Steve, if you are around, let us know. I can also, let me change the settings really quick so that, Steve, if you'd like to talk, you can just unmute yourself. But someone's curious if we've actually seen marbled murrelets come back into the park.
To my knowledge, no, so this fire happened right at the end of nesting season. So maybe some of the Murrelet babies made it, but we don't know. And then the start of the nesting season this year, it's going to happen in a few months from now. So we have yet to see, to my knowledge. Yeah.
I'm here now, Zane. Can you hear me?
Okay, cool, Steve. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, about the snags, Murrelets generally can't use snags because they need some green foliage or green branches, some cover to protect the nest site from ravens, which are a very common predator on Murrelet nests. Then the other thing, a good thing, is that even though 61% of the Murrelet habitat area is burned in the fire, not every tree burned. So in looking at some trees I had marked before the fire, about 50% of the trees still survived that had Murrelet suitable branches. So there will be some suitable nesting sites in the burn area, but I estimate that it's probably only going to be about maybe 60% of the number of nest sites that was present before the fire.
Thanks,
Thank you
Steve.
for clarifying that. And then on birds too, maybe Steve, you can talk about this. Are there fewer or more corvids in the burned area? Have you noticed any other like ecological changes that would impact the murrelets?
Well, I've been out to the park 6 times since the fire, and there's not much bird life or wildlife or any kind of life in the park, but I have always detected ravens on every trip out there. But even ravens need, they need other prey items to feed on, so there's not a lot for them to feed on. So I don't see them being more effective predators just because there'll probably be fewer ravens along with fewer murrelets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, we did hear a turkey in the park, which was kind of bizarre.
Neat.
I've never heard of that in Big Basin.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, during the fire by Lodge Road area.
If anyone else would like to speak and has a question, you can indicate that in the chat. Again, I think might be the best way to do it. I have a question for you, Zane, about the fact that we have redwood mortality. And I'm curious, like, how bad is that? Because I've heard a lot about how the fire interval used to be much more frequent, and that created a different density for our forests than we're currently seeing. And now we have much denser tree coverage within a lot of our forest ecosystems throughout the state. And so is it necessarily a bad thing that we have the mortality level that we have, at least amongst redwoods?
I would say the park-wide numbers of 1 to 2%, that's not too much of a problem. It's these areas of extreme burns where 40 or 50% of the trees, of the redwood trees specifically, died, and then all of the Doug fir died. Like these areas where we have, 10 or so redwoods, 10 or 20 living redwoods that will still live per acre, that's pretty rough. And that, I don't think there's a silver lining there. The extreme areas of the park got hammered really bad.
And for the mortality amongst the really old trees, like how old are they?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we all have, or probably a lot of us have heard that redwood trees, as they get bigger, they grow actually faster. And that is true. But what is not true is that they lose efficiency. So per like weight of leaves, they produce less and less photosynthetic like sugar, for instance. So it's slower recovery time for older trees, first of all, because they aren't as efficient at their photosynthesis. And then it'll be
Sorry, I
slower-
just stopped
Sorry.
sharing your screen so we could see
Oh,
your
no
face more.
worries. Great. Yeah, so slower recovery time for older trees, and then the older trees need to be producing enough photosynthesis to make rings around the entire trunk, which becomes difficult. So older trees have more to lose when there's a big crown fire, because they have these huge, they're used to these huge crowns that immediately go away and burn up. So yeah, older, like trees 400, 500 plus, they're going to have a harder time. And then 1,000+ year old trees like we see all around headquarters, those trees are having a rough time. We saw a number of large trees that didn't have any green on them.
That's so interesting. That's
Even-
like the opposite of what I would have assumed.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we've got some more questions that have come in. We're a little after 7, but we'll take a few more questions and then let everyone go. Why is it that one area burns into the ground and right next to it not?
Wind
Yeah.
dynamics, I'm not sure. That's a meteorological thing. I really don't know.
Luck.
But what I can tell you is that it's like slope aspects make a big difference.
Mhm.
So the fire, if it's coming from the north, trees that are on north facing slopes are getting blasted by this fire laden wind, whereas on southern slopes, maybe not as much. So you have these dynamics like that. Or we found areas that weren't burned on tops of ridges, which or not burned, I mean, not having crown fires on tops of ridges. And that might be simply because they're at the top. And so the flames are not getting that high. But yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't found a great thing to explain why some areas burned and some areas didn't.
And I guess this kind of like is bouncing off that too. Another question someone had about the specific areas that are at that 40 to 50% mortality. How big of a swath are those locations? Does that make sense? Like what percentage of the park?
What percentage of the park?
Burned at that.
I'm not sure. I would say at least in the headquarters areas and the areas that I've seen, 10 or 20% of the park. That's what I would say, maybe. Steve, I don't know. That'd be my guess. Oh,
Can you hear me?
muted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Just from driving around the park on my various trips there, I just came up with about 25% had that extreme burn category. We need someone like yourself to produce a burn severity map from the aerial photos. That would be a great tool if we could get that.
Yeah.
Get on it, Zane. Let's see, we've got other questions. Are trees in the park going to be replanted or is it going to be left to recover on its own? I think you mentioned something about maybe seeding Doug fir.
I don't think anything's happening yet. I don't think anyone's doing anything yet. Lisa, you're shaking your head.
I agree.
Do you know something I don't? Oh, sorry.
No, I agree that right now they're doing the traditional disaster recovery effort, repairing the roads, putting in new culverts, hauling away damaged building debris, all the, fixing utilities, all that stuff. Nothing really biological that I've seen.
Yeah, and I know I saw that they are accepting like volunteer applications now for Big Basin. There's a lot of interest, obviously, but I didn't see restoration work as one of the areas. A lot of cleanup, a lot of trail work, a lot of work to get access. Karen's also curious about the chimney tree on the Redwood Loop and how many new chimney trees there are now. And I know Lisa's going to be sharing with us a resource that we'll share out at the tomorrow about the history of the chimney tree. But yeah, Zane or Steve, I saw you raising your hand. Yeah. What do you have to say about future chimney trees?
Yeah, I went out and I looked at the chimney tree and it didn't make it. It's a large part of the bowl broke off, but I'm guessing there are a lot more chimney trees in the park now. It's just a matter of finding them.
Yeah, we found a couple just spending, one day in the park together, we found a few trees. So yeah, they're around, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Lisa,
and
do
you
you
realize-
want to add anything about that historic chimney tree?
That was just an incredible tree. It burned for 14 months after the 1900 fire. 14 months. It erupted twice. That's a long period of time. So I think the important message here is that the fires are not over for us. They could potentially still erupt, particularly if we have a very hot summer. I mean, I think we're very fortunate so far. It's been a rather cool start to this summer. But if we have a hot summer, there may be potential hot spots. There's another story I want to just touch on, and that's Josephine McCracken talking about the hot roots of the madrones and the manzanitas. Fires don't only burn above the surface, they burn underneath the ground. And, we've got a potential big problem when, the fire season is so long in California that, stuff that is still burning underneath the soil may erupt again. And so I don't know if Zane would like to pick up on that, but, it's my worry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So redwood forests do reburn sometimes that same year. We saw a fire break out just a few weeks ago in Big Basin from one of these trees that must have been smoldering, and then eventually that caught. So there is a lot of redwood foliage on the ground right now, just ready and waiting to burn if a fire starts. So that is something that could happen over this next fire season, is we could see residual fire from a tree or something, or from underground or something like that, coming back up.
And that's one of the reasons why the park is still closed. I know parts of Rancho del Oso are opening Memorial Day weekend, but not the burned parts. And, still wait and see about access to Big Basin. But for now, yeah, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done up there. And someone was commenting in the chat about whether or not like reseeding is right or wait and see is right. And yeah, we'll just have to see what the different land agencies decide on that route. But I did think that was a good opportunity for me to chime in about our community science project. So community science is all about engaging the community into doing science. And for our project, we are requesting that people who do have access to the burn zone currently take a look at what's going on around you and record it. And we're using the platform iNaturalist to do that. And we have a lot of programs to help you get started. I will share my screen really quick. Let me stop this. So you can see some other events that are, I keep not having the right screen open, sorry, that are coming up. So we've had tonight's talk, and then on Monday, we're going to be with our interns up at Marshall Field by campus, and our student interns are going through data and the iNaturalist data and looking at pre-fire data from within the CZU Lightning Complex burn zone. And then they're also doing field studies at a site as like a pre-fire study. So we are going to be meeting up with them and learning more about collecting data and using iNaturalist. And then museum members are invited to join us up at the Bonnie Doon Ecological Reserve in June to see how the fire has impacted that habitat, which is one of those sandhills habitats that Zane mentioned earlier when he was talking about Quail Hollow. So I'll be sharing links for how to be involved with this project. And I know that, again, there's a lot of areas within the burn zone that there isn't access yet. So for now, we can kind of just continue taking in this information and preparing ourselves for when we do have access to be able to go out there and help contribute to this understanding by taking data of those understory plants that Zane was talking about that are popping up right now, so that we can learn more about how our flora responds to events like this. And it's 7:15, so I think we should probably let you all go. Again, I'll be following up with an email. And Zane, yeah.
One thing, so thank you first of all. And there was one question in the chat that I saw asking, where do people volunteer for volunteering with this effort? Do you know, Marissa?
Yeah, and I responded that I'll share a link in my follow-up email too. And it's like a Google form that Big Basin's put out. There's a lot of people filling it out. So like, don't get your hopes up, or don't hold your breath, I guess. But definitely if you have interest in helping out, then fill it out, and they will get back to you if they can use your helping hands. And it was trail work and debris cleanup and artifact cleaning, things like that.
Great,
So,
yeah. Thanks, Marissa, and thanks everybody.
Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you, Zane. This has been so informative. And again, I've been recording it. And so we will share a link afterwards, because I'm sure a lot of you want to go back and revisit this. So thank you. And thank you, Justin. And thank you, Lisa, Santa Cruz Valley Museum and the Norris Center for your continued partnership.
You all have a good evening.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, Zane.
Thanks. Yep.
Thanks, Zane. Thanks, Marissa. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Have a great night.